All right, guys. I'm going to go ahead and get started. The Third Estate revolts, a time of crisis. In May 1789, Louis XVI had been on the throne of France for 15 years. France was on the brink of financial collapse. The cause was not a mystery. French kings had always engaged in costly wars. The last war had been a glorious success, but debt was a huge problem in France. Sorry, having an issue here. France had helped the Americans win their independence from the British, France's old enemy. Great Britain had been crippled, but the war had been expensive, and France had piled up an enormous new debt on top of all of their old debts of the past. Plus, there was an extravagant spending at the royal court. Eventually, the French government was spending half of its income just to pay the interest on its loans. Paying off the loans themselves was actually impossible. Nothing less than serious economic and political reform could fix the problem. That meant that the aristocracy would have to make some changes too. They would have to pay higher taxes. You think that they would like that idea? No, not at all. They would have to give up some of the privileges of their birth. But Louis XVI was a weak leader. It would take a strong hand to force genuine reform on the aristocracy. The aristocrats knew that the government was in trouble and they were under a great threat, but they were not willing to give up something for nothing in return. We will agree to make some changes, they told the king, but you must call a meeting of the Estates General. Now that's one of your questions, right? Okay, so it says right here, what was the Estates General? It is an assembly that made up of representatives from France's 3 estates. All 3 were represented at the Estates General. But you're going to see that there's going to be a major issue with that here in just a minute. Now, they hadn't even met in over 100 years. Think about that. So for any reform, they had to meet, but they haven't even met in over 100 years. So there's not been any reform whatsoever in over about 150 years, actually, because I think it was 1640 since the last time they had actually met. The Estates General originated in an era before kings had absolute power. Its original purpose was to give advice to the king and to approve new taxes. The nobles thought that a meeting of the Estates General, which hadn't met since 1614, I apologize, not 1640, 1614. That's actually before Louis XIV, isn't it? They could push through some changes of their own. Reluctantly, Louis agreed. Neither the nobles nor the king recognized that he was opening the door for revolution. The Estates General meets. May 2nd, 1789. The king sat in a dazzling hall of mirrors at Versailles, waiting to receive representatives from the 3 estates. The enormous doors swung open, and in marched the representatives, called the deputies from the first estate. These representatives were parish priests in black robes, a high-ranking church leaders, such as bishops and archbishops, in their rich, elegantly embroidered robes. The king received the deputies, nodding and smiling politely at each. The deputies filed out of the massive doors, and they opened again to admit deputies from the second estate, members of the aristocracy, the nobility. The members were splendidly dressed in satin suits and lace cuffs, plumed hats, silver vests, and brilliantly colored silk coats, their swords hanging at their side. Again, the king received them gloriously. You remember those pictures I showed you of the aristocracy? At the time, it was very fashionable for the men to wear high heels and the makeup and the large wigs and all of their silk clothing. Outside the hall waited the deputies of the Third Estate, the commoners. The commoners were dressed in plain, simple clothes. They waited 3 hours before being received, and not in the Hall of Mirrors, but in a smaller room where they marched in single file past a solemn and unsmiling king. The deputies of the Third Estate could see that they would have to fight for real change. According to the ancient rules of the Estates General, each of the three estates met separately to vote on a proposal. Then, each estate cast one vote based on the decision of its members. In that way, the first and second estates, which usually had a common interest in preserving their privileges, dominated the Estates General. Now the Third Estate wanted to change the rules so that it would have a real voice in the reform. Deputies knew that the nobility and clergy wanted to keep the rights and privileges that they had always had under the Ancien Regime, which means the old regime. Okay, that term, you can use them intertwined. You could say old regime or Ancien Regime. Or you could even call it the ancient regime. Ancien is just the French word for ancient. But the Third Estate had more deputies than the other two estates combined. The deputies knew that some of the clergy, especially parish priests, and even a few members of the nobility, were sympathetic towards their problems. The Third Estate wanted all three estates to meet together, with each deputy casting one vote, right? So the Third Estate had way more deputies, so they would think that they would outnumber the other two, right? There's way more people, but guess what? That's not the way that things were done at that time. Each estate only had one vote. So not each deputy, but each estate had only one vote. With each deputy casting one. Okay, if this happened, the Third Estate could easily control the outcome of the voting. Naturally, the nobles said, no way. And the king sided with them. The king was agreeing with the nobles. Each estate was assigned to meet in a separate meeting hall. Here's another great picture that we will definitely take some time to look at after I'm done reading. See what it says here? Look at that. It says, the ordinary person in France at this time felt taxes imposed on them by the king and the nobility were overwhelmingly unfair, and they were absolutely right. A National Assembly is created. In the large meeting hall assigned to the Third Estate, the deputies wandered around, getting acquainted with one another. The public was admitted to the hall, and they crowded around the deputies, offering advice and support. Over the next few days, the meetings were noisy and confusing. Some deputies were willing to settle for small changes, but others argued for nothing less than a constitution and the end of the ancient regime. A pamphlet, I think this one is one of your terms, written by the clergyman Abbe Sieyès. Abbe was his position, Sieyès was his last name, created a stir. Sieyès was known as a champion of the poor. He had a weak voice and was not an effective public speaker. So he wrote a pamphlet to express his ideas about the Third Estate. The pamphlet was read by many people and often quoted during the arguments of reform. Listen to this. This was actually written in the pamphlet. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been up until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. So in other words, he's saying, listen, we make up France, 97% of France, yet we don't even have a political say. What do we want? Something. That's what he's saying. And you know what I mean? It's as clearly as I can state it, looks unfair. By the end of the month, they all could agree all they could, I'm sorry, I apologize. All they could agree on was that they should ask deputies from the First Estate to join them in their meeting hall. The deputies sent a delegation to the hall where the clergy were meeting. The gentlemen of the Commons, announced the leader of the delegation in solemn tones, invite the gentlemen of the clergy in the name of God, of peace, and for the national interest to meet them in their hall to consult upon the means of bringing about the accord or the agreement same thing, which is so vital at this moment for the public welfare. So they go over to the First Estate and they say, hey, please come and join us. Let's talk about this. Some of the clergy were excited at the announcement and would have gone immediately, but there were others, more conservative clergymen, excuse me, mostly those of the higher church who came from noble families, wanted to discuss the proposal first before agreeing to meet. The delegation went back to their meeting hall to wait. They were prepared to remain in session until an answer was received. Hours passed, and then the delegation was sent to repeat the invitation. Still no answer. Days passed. Finally, on June the 13th, 3 priests appeared at the door of the meeting hall. They wanted to join the deputies of the Third Estate. Inside the hall, the deputies cheered, clapped, and embraced the priests and one another with tears in their eyes. Over the next few days, more priests followed, and then even more. The Third Estate was ready to begin its real work. Abbe Sieyès reminded the deputies that the Third Estate represented 98% of the population. It's closer to 97% of the population. He suggested a new name. He suggested the name of the National Assembly. Is that one of your terms? Yeah. Okay, good. Oh, it is a question. Okay, good. The suggestion raised an uproar in the hall. Immediately, a debate over the name raged furiously, with as many as 100 deputies all shouting at once. To take that name would mean that the Third Estate intended to represent the whole nation and take responsibility for reform. There would be no going back. The debate continued into the night, while outside a summer thunderstorm raged. The next morning, in 1789, the rain ended and the sky was clear. The deputies met again and voted. The name National Assembly was agreed upon by 491 to 89. Then, news of the vote reached the meeting of the First Estate. They took a vote as well and agreed to join the new National Assembly. Eventually, the nobles would also join them. The tennis court oath. This is really important here. I think this is a couple of your questions here. What question number are you on? 12. Okay. Awesome. All right. All righty. The king was outraged when he heard the news. And so the next day, when deputies of the National Assembly arrived at their meeting hall, guess what they found? The doors were all locked. The king plotted to hold a separate meeting of the 3 estates and declare the actions of the Third Estate illegal. He intended to keep the commoners in their place, but the deputies would not back down. And that's a big deal because you're dealing with an aristocracy, right? You're dealing with an autocratic aristocracy, an autocracy. So this king has divine powers. And all of a sudden, these people are challenging his divine powers. A king is not going to like that very much, is he? Even this king. Someone suggested that they meet at a nearby building that housed the royal indoor tennis courts. The deputies crowded into the building, while outside a crowd gathered shouting, "Vive l'Assemblée!" That just means long live the assembly, okay? Inside, deputies debated moving their meeting to Paris, where they could have protection from the people. Then a young deputy rose to speak. He urged them not to move to Paris, but instead to all take an oath to stay together, to stay persistent in their goal, and never to separate until they had written a constitution. Then a guy by the name of Jean Bailly, Jean-Sylvain Bailly. All you have to remember, you can call him Bailey, I don't care, because that's his name if we pronounce it in English, Bailly, who had chosen to lead the meeting, stood at the table made from a door ripped from off of its hinges. One by one, the deputies came forward, arms raised in salute, and signed the oath. This became known as the tennis court oath. Every deputy but one signed. The Constitution would be written. The French Revolution had begun. Here's a picture of the French Revolution. Now, I mean, of the tennis court oath. And this was very, very significant because you remember the painting when the United States, and well, we weren't the United States yet, but when we signed the Declaration of Independence, it's a very similar painting. Okay. And that is going to be your chapter. It's very short, very succinct, and I hope you got all of your answers.